and do some quick technical check. I know Fabio is here, and we have your presentation. Is John Casey or Trevor Collins here? Do you have slides? They're on the computer, fine, thank you. And what about Jane Secker and Chris Morrison? Are your slides up? Good, so we're set. This session is live streamed, so I just need confirmation from the speakers that you're okay with being online. And because of the live streaming, please also speak into the microphone so that the sound picks up. Well, you have a choice of a handheld microphone, or if you prefer the attachable one. And that's all. All I will do, I will only step in if you start running out of time. Otherwise, this whole hour and 20 minutes is yours. Fabio, you're the first one.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. So good to be here in the community. I've met so many people which I think I knew. I know on Twitter and other things, but I'm asking myself if this is enough. It's much better to meet all of you in person. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about are the results of a project we are running in UNIR, the Universidad Internacional de La Rioja in Spain, and mainly, namely in this Institute for Technology and Education called ITED. It's a new animal we just created at the end of last year in there. So basically, I'm telling you a bit about the Open Educators Factory project. Well, I will just briefly go through the project, present you with some results and some critical points, and then hopefully get some hints or questions or ideas from you on how to bring this forward. We have some ideas, but it's always good to get more. So basically, the rationale of this project has to do with the dichotomy between the sort of, to use Martin's Weller words, the victory of open education. It seems we all agree that open is the way to go, but at the same time, if we would enter into university this morning, probably at least in Italy or in my own country or in Spain, my working country, what we would find is not so open. So there is something there. Let's say this is the year of open, great. We have the year and the day of almost everything. But I have the feeling that we are still a lot, at least in the south of Europe, talking about Europe, in this eternal experimentation phase. So, I mean, for things to become really systemic, something is missing. And so we were asking ourselves, why change is so slow? And what do we need? So basically, we have been discussing this in many events like this. And of course, you need many things, many ingredients. You need policy, you need leadership, you need a lot of things. In this specific project, we decided to focus on educators. So on professors, lecturers, faculty, anyone in the university who has an education role. And what we say, I like this slide very much. In fact, the picture is not so peaceful, but at least they are, let's say, not fighting yet. So we claim that we need a peaceful army of open educators. In fact, typically, you know, even when educators embrace the change, they do this because somebody is asking them to do it. Somebody is pushing them to do so. Somebody is suggesting them that, you know, they should change something in their daily work, but they're not really the agents of change. They're not really pushing the thing. So our question was, what could we do in order for a typical lecturer, tutor, professor, you know, to really become the driver of change? So basically we started to ask ourselves some questions, and first of all we realized that a definition of open educator, a shared definition, was not there. I mean, we tried to define what do we mean by open educator, what we think should be meant by open educator. Well, we realized a number of definitions or of sort of definitions were there, focusing on specific aspects. Of course, content probably is the most studied one, but an holistic definition was not there. So we said, okay, let's see if we can put together a definition. And then out of this, of the dimension of this definition, actually we went into a more practical part of the work where we built a very simple platform that we are now using with professors, you know, for them to become more open, so to transform into open educators. And I will show this to you in a moment. There you see the faces of the colleagues who have helped us both in the interview. Well, this project is a rather classic one. We ran the literature review, some interviews. Then we did a lot of interactions in terms of this framework that I will show you in a moment. And the last person on the right is the vice director of the Polytechnic of Torino, where we are actually running the pilot of the platform. So first, the definition. What is an open educator? I don't know if you have ask yourself the question, or if we give this for granted, you know, how many of us are educators in the room? Good. How many of you are open educators? So, and you are raising your hands following a definition which is in your head, but I guess if I would ask each one of you, you would start putting a lot of things there, all correct. But you know, when we really started, you know, if you Google Open Educator, then you enter into the realm, you know, of many different things. So we try to put it down. You know, an open educator is an educator who chooses to use open approaches, and the choice is pretty important. And Catherine Cronin has done a lot of work on the choice of being open, when possible and appropriate. Of course, we don't want to hack the system completely. You know, we know that we are living in systems that were there before us, with a clear aim to remove all necessary barriers to learning. And then we focus there on an open online identity, which we think should be there, on social networking, and especially on the issue that the open educator should be very aware of the fact that working in the open has to do a lot with being responsible towards the work of others, and this is not minor. Basically, our definition here is just a few lines, but it's a bit more complex. Is based on 4 pillars, on 4 components: open design first, open content, open teaching, and open assessment. Open research is out, because here we're talking about education, let's say, and teaching, but of course is somewhere in there and transversal. So we bet on these 4 components, and out of these components we developed a framework. Pretty simple one. Maybe some of the interviewees you've seen there have told us that's maybe too simple, but we wanted to keep it simple because this is the basis out of which we developed the platform. And basically for each of the areas, design, content, teaching, and assessment, we designed, let's say, we spotted 3 categories, 3 steps that an educator has to go through in order to become open. And of course, what you can clearly see there is that the upper you go into the framework, the more collaborative you become. So the first thing that we found out of this first phase of the project has to do with the relation between openness and collaboration, which is obvious to some of us, to most of us, but maybe it's not obvious outside this room, you know. If you look at typically, well, you will see the results later on, but it's hard to think of an OER specialist which is not collaborating daily on content and on other activities. So there you can see basically, I won't go in detail, but of course this every single cell there is described with a number of activities that the educator is doing. But this is just to show you that we try to give, both in the definition and in the framework, we try to keep into account all these dimensions, all these areas of work by giving to them the same level of importance. So we didn't start from open content and then, you know, when you work with open content and you do pedagogy, you become an open pedagogist. No, we think you can do open pedagogy theoretically even without using fully open content. So the 4 dimensions are can also be seen as a sort of standalone dimensions. And then we started to build up the platform, which is pretty simple. So teachers fill in a questionnaire, very short and very basic, where we never mention OER, we never mention OEP. It's just the language that a teacher can understand. And then the system is providing as a feedback the whole framework with the professor in the different cells. And this is, to us, was an intermediary step, but when we run a couple of focus groups, this seems to be the most important thing. So people like to see where they perform, and especially one thing we can do with the platform, they like to see where they perform with respect to colleagues from the same universities. So this is a useful feature, especially for leaders of universities, which can see how their department perform, for example. In the case of of the Polytechnic Torino, where we got almost 200 replies. For example, we have discussed a lot with the leaders of the university to check exactly who are the best performers in terms of content, who is in needing of more training, for example, in terms of open design and stuff like that. So there already, the teacher can understand that there is much more than OER, first of all, and that, can see how he or she positions in the different columns. Based on this, he or she receives some recommendations. So if you're good in OER, you should maybe take this advanced course to become even better. If you're very basic in open design, never thought that you can design your course not by yourself because you're not the best on earth. There is maybe somebody else who has done this before. So just, use what they did. So in that case, let's say the guidelines, here we're talking about some videos, we have some courses, some reading, some papers and stuff like that. So you get some recommendations, and of course you can go back to check the progresses. This is our dream, that people would take the recommendation, then would improve, and then would go back. This is never happening, but at least the first 3 steps are pretty easy to be taken. Now, let's see, imagine you are the vice rector for pedagogy of Politecnico di Torino, or other big and, let's say, renowned university in Italy. 182 quite balanced, I would say, professors or educators replied, and here you see, for the first time, actually, the picture of all the respondents. So you can see, first of all, that you have a lot of collaborative designers. So most of the respondents do not design courses and training activities, learning activities, teaching activities on their own. They do it in collaboration, but in small groups collaboration. Typically, it's with the colleague next door, with the colleague in the other continent, but really few of them do it openly. So only 7 out of 182. But these 7 are gold for this vice rector, because if the vice rector, is smart enough to think that the more you open up, the more this is promoting what you do, and the more you are building capacity also on the other columns, I would like, if I was in here, to know who these 7 are, and maybe organize a small activity for them to pass over the knowledge to others. If we look at the content, we see that we have a lot of people new to OER, and this was expected, but still we have 22 people who, following their replies, they are placed among the OER specialists. And 22 people is already a big group. So it's not just like a couple of champions. We have out of 180, you have some 22 knowledgeable guys there. In terms of teaching, the majority is traditional, so it's the classic frontal teaching, but still we have 80 engaging teachers and you have 8 open teachers. When I say open teacher, these are people who, let's say, are not afraid of opening up the classroom for real. So not afraid of getting students who are not enrolled in the course, who are not afraid of really breaking down boundaries. That is a rather extreme definition of open teacher. That's why it's only 8. At the very beginning, we had been a bit more calm and a bit more cautious with that definition, and it appeared that everybody was an open teacher. So we had to, change it a bit. Also because, as you will see later, teachers tend to naturally overrate their openness. That's quite human. In terms of evaluation, the great majority is evaluating in a traditional way. This, of course, has to do with the fact that there are boundaries in the institution, so you are obliged to evaluate students in the classical way, but still, you have 13 people who are letting students evaluate in a peer students way, and who are also engaging openly other communities. So, for example, a professor from software engineering who is actually sending students out there in open source communities, and for them to be evaluated and to come back. Do whatever you want, come back and show me that your work adds some value for that community. And this is pretty, it's pretty shocking. So as you can see there, with the system, you can easily get an understanding of the situation of where your teaching corp should improve if you want, and who are the educators you could work on this. Well, 2 main findings to date. First, that openness has many entry points, and I put there this conceptualization by the Joint Research Center of the European Commission in Seville. They're doing a lot of work on open education, and they have these 10 dimensions of open education. We have just 4, because of course we deal only with teaching. But the idea there is that you are not obliged to start from content. Some people might simply like to share or to be open in different areas than on content, and then they might jump on the OER train at the second stage. So the idea there is that in order to convince your staff and your faculty to embrace the open, and so to become part of the army, I was telling before, you don't have to start from the first level of the army. You can become a cook in the army if you're good in cooking, and then maybe you can discover that also you like fighting some battles. And that the relation between openness and collaboration is clear. Basically there what we did was to ask, was to check the position in the different dimensions and areas of the respondents with respect to their use of social media and their collaborative attitude within and outside their teaching work. So basically what you see there is that the more collaborative they are, the more open they are. And this is pretty clear. It's not clear in all dimensions. We still are working on the data, but I would say that as a general principle, as a general result, it's hard to say that you have a trend of being open and not being collaborative. I would say in general that is quite for granted. We also learned that, of course, each teacher is different, and we are overgeneralizing in this work. That's obvious. And when every single time we speak to a teacher, because we find that this teacher is doing something outside the patterns, we discover a lot of stuff. We discover a lot of individual thing by the teacher. Of course, institutional context matters. The Polytechnic of Torino, for example, is a pretty free environment to experiment. We have other universities. We are doing this work, for example, in Ireland. We have the Teaching and Learning Program, who is getting us a lot of answers from different universities. We have a number of responses by South Mediterranean countries through the OpenMed project, and their boundaries are much stronger. So there, a number of people say, of course, I'd like to do that, but I can't. In Polytechnico, you do not seem to have this problem so strongly, apart from evaluation, of course. Terminology is very important. We had to redo the questions like 15 times. That's not obvious, and especially is important. This is available in English, French, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese. Every time, it's a battle. It's a lot of work to really find the right way to tell things. And of course, as I was saying before, teachers, everyone tend to overrate their openness. It's hard for teachers to humbly say, you know what? No, I do this by myself because I've always done like that. No, I do it in collaboration. Show this to me. Well, no, I do it on my own. So let's say that's that's also important to be taken into account. Now the platform is there. We are working to foster the use. We're working together with a number of partners there, with the UNESCO chair we hold at the university, with ICD, with Eden, with the OEC, and with the Brazilian Institute from the University of Sao Paulo I'm collaborating with, so in order to translate it into Portuguese. And the idea is to put this platform at the service of the community. So both individual teachers can just take the questionnaire and see how they do, and they can either use it for advocacy within the university, or they can use it just to see, as a self-learning and self-development exercise. On the other hand, leaders and managers in universities can use it to see how their group perform. So in the case of Torino, the leaders there are really enthusiastic. They know now who is really performing and who is active in openness and who is not, which is not something easy, because how do you grasp that if you have 800 staff? At least you can get a rough understanding of who are the best performers and who are the most advanced. And now we are actually focusing on the relation on a new research phase, focusing on the relation between openness and collaboration, what we said before, and trying to see if it's possible to engage more soldiers, Pacific soldiers, by convincing them to network, especially in countries like Italy or Spain. People like to collaborate a lot, but not only there. Of course, we have a Latin attitude to talk a lot, as you can hear from me, and to collaborate. So instead of telling them you must become fluent in OER, it's like, why don't you work together with your colleagues and to try to see if this entry point can be an easier entry point for them in order to then start using open license and all the things we all know. Final slide. We are doing some work also on the relation between openness and digital literacy. There you see a few frameworks, the framework from JISC and from the Mozilla Foundation. I guess you must be aware of those. The one on the right is again by the Joint Research Center of the Commission, and it is called DigComp Edu. What these guys are doing, I don't know if you are aware, they are adapting and building a competencies framework for digital skills, so a digital competence framework specifically for educators, targeted on secondary school educators, but hopefully useful also for primary school and for adult and university. And I would say that if you look, we did an analysis of where openness stands in all these three and in many more frameworks, and I can say that the trend is to include more and more mentions to OER, more and more openness dimensions in the digital literacy frameworks, and I would say, let's say, 21st century skills, there you have a lot of terminology also. But let's say the trend is pretty positive, and of course we are trying to, on one side, to learn from this, on the other side we are trying to influence this, of course, because there are many working groups in the Commission, you know, European Commission loves working groups, so there are a number of ways to provide an input there. This is an open research project with its own page on Wiki Educator. So if you just go on wikieducator.org and you search for Open Educators Factor, you can find the updated status of the research. You can comment, criticize. People do criticize, contribute, let's say, but also criticize, which is good, I think. And so there you can see exactly where we are in the project. And as I said before, the thing is now there. We are coming up with a version 2, which simply looks nicer because, you know, UNESCO and ICD like fancy platforms. At the moment, the platform is focusing on the, I would say, on the content and on the mechanism, on the working mechanism. We are making a nicer version, let's say, but the core will not change. So at that address, you can test the platform. It really takes 10 minutes to run the questionnaire and see where you are and get some recommendations, and then you will decide if this is useful and you want to promote it further, or if this is not. I mean, some people told me, you know, very interesting, but that's not for me. Okay, that's fine. I mean, we don't want, you know, to convince everybody, but many people told us, look, I did it myself, and then I forced my colleagues to do it, and in some universities, people are writing to us, please add my university to the possible lists, and give me, I am a professor, I'm nothing, not even a leader, just give me the right to see how my colleagues are doing, because I want to use this to convince my vice rector, my president, my director, that we have a team of people working in the open here, and that we can do some stuff. So this is starting to appear also as I would say, an advocacy tool more than aside than a capacity building tool. And this, in fact, was something which was not there at the beginning, but professors are starting to use it. From Ireland, we had a couple of cases. From Australia, another one, who is, let's say, they're using this as a tool to convince with some data, even by saying, look, we perform better than that other university. Of course, we have limited numbers, so it's hard to say that. But at least for the data we have, we are doing something. Something is going on in terms of openness, and these are the best performers. Typically, the professor who does this is the best performer. So it's, of course, a self-promotion tool, but as long as this brings to an increased openness within the institution, we like it, and we play on the ego of professors very, very easily. So the bar is open. Please visit that, and thank you very much for your patience. Alec.
Thank you very much. We have a bit of time for discussion if any of you have comments. Yes.
The people who are doing the digital literacy framework, could you just repeat who they are again, please?
This is the Joint Research Center in Seville of the European Commission. Formerly it was called IPTS, formerly it was the Institute for Perspective Technological Studies. Now the name is JRC. And this work is still, at the moment, there is a, should I take the mic?
Yeah.
At the moment, just for you to know, at the moment this is in press, so it's not published yet, but there is an open consultation available. So you can see each one of these areas has a lot of dimensions, and each dimension has a lot of indicators to exactly specify each skills. So it's all there available for consultation.
Okay, we'll take one more comment and then switch.
Jörg Pareigis from Karlstad University in Sweden. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's not so much a comment, just a question. You mentioned Eden, and I know Alistair Creeman is involved there. Do you have any interest or contact in the Swedish context already?
Yeah, well, as you know, the Eden conference this year is going to be in Sweden. So we hope, well, this will be presented there. Eden is a partner of this, it's a collaborative partner, informal partner, because let's say they believe in the usefulness of the thing. So I would say that it will be present in the conference this year, which hopefully a lot of people from Sweden and from the north. But it's we are working also a bit, we're trying to get a contact through EBBA and Alistair with the Swedish e-learning association, but it's thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Fabio. Now we'll have our next talk by John Casey.
Yes.
Also representing Trevor Collins, who I understand is not here with us,
Trevor
right?
can't make it today, my colleague from the OU. I'll just find my...
Will you be fine with launching the slides?
I think so, if I can find my thing. Here we go. Yeah.
Okay.
Grand.
It works,
Oh,
yes.
good.
There's a clicker here, and please remember to speak into the microphone.
Okay, I'm going to talk to you today about web annotation. Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, can I ask one question?
Yeah.
Will the slides be shared with us?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah, I'll put mine on SlideShare, and they're also on the Clipper blog as well, so you can find them there. Yes, I'm going to talk to you about web annotation and our project a little bit. Our project is doing audio and video online annotation. And really, I want to, I guess, report on our encounter with the web annotation community, which we met last year in Berlin. We didn't know the community existed as such, but it really impressed us, and we think there's a lot of potential there for OER work, so I'll talk to you about that. And I'll talk to you about what I think some of the political issues that are involved in that, and then I'll finish up with a little bit about the Clipper project that we're working on. Just get me right with time. Oh yeah, before I go any further. When I was looking at the title for this, I was thinking about this song, You, Me, Them, or this line out of a song from the Blues Brothers. It's a 60s pop song. And I was trawling around the web trying to find the words. And there's lots of websites that feature song lyrics, and increasingly web annotation has been used commercially as well to make websites sticky. So political blogs, commercial sites are adding this tool to them. So there was an actual web annotation tool on that site, which was really interesting. So what is web annotation? Well, this is the W3C working group that we encountered in Berlin. And as I say, it really impressed us. And it's moving beyond a lot of bookmarking tools and stuff like that, Evernote and so on. So their aims, I think, are worth just repeating very briefly. They make the point that traditional annotation that we're all doing, some of us are doing now, scribbling on bits of paper, it's a well-established thing. You know, we scribble on books, maps, and other physical media. Web annotations are an attempt to recreate and extend that functionality as a new layer of interactivity and linking it on top of the web. And it's just actually worth stressing this, because I think this has got really big implications. The next two sentences, it will allow anyone to annotate anything, anywhere, be it a web page, an ebook, a video, and that's what we're doing. We're annotating video and audio, an image, an audio stream, or data in a raw or visualized form. Web annotations can be linked, shared between services, tracked back to their origins, searched and discovered, and stored wherever the author wishes. That is the author of the annotation, not the work that's been annotated. So we start to see a divergence here between the content and the annotation. The vision is for a decentralized and open annotation infrastructure, and this really appeals to us in the Clipper project. I'll talk a little bit about the three main forms of web annotation in a minute: the textual annotations, image annotations, and audio-visual annotations. So here's a dead simple conceptual model of an annotation system for the web. My annotations and your web page are two distinct entities. So we're moving beyond comments on a web page. So they're superimposed on your web page by my annotation system. Now this is the interesting thing. You may or may not see this, that someone is doing this with your website. You might not even know it is out there on the web in private or public form. And this has got some interesting implications, as I hope to show you later on. So here's an example of me opening an account in an annotation system called Hypothesis, and I've annotated the OER17 website. Now, just out of interest here, does anyone know of Hypothesis? Great. So I'm still amazed by this. It's such a cool thing. So I've highlighted the text, and on the right-hand side is my notes about that text, and I've made that public. Now, the interesting thing about the Hypothesis system is if you make your annotation public, it has, by its terms and conditions, it's got a default Creative Commons 0 license attached to your annotation, which is, and you have no choice about that. So that's quite an interesting thing. Your private annotations are copyright to you, and it's up to you what you do with them. And they offer a group functionality as well, which has got a lot of potential for educational work. So, I think I've jumped forward here. All right, here we go. Yeah, so that's good. Yeah, so the politics and utility of this are quite interesting. So I'm saying that this seems to be quite an OER-friendly technology and infrastructure, and I particularly like the idea of this being an infrastructure on the web. So the annotations and notes that people are creating can become media-rich and shared with others. So it is moving beyond comments on a web page. So these discussions can happen in and around a web page, and particularly in the States, we found that a lot of people are using annotation systems to facilitate discussions. They're almost replacing forums in VLEs, which we found quite interesting. And these discussions are happening around content that may be inside the institution, or it could be somewhere else. But there's other interesting things about this as well. There's socio-economic implication here for the traditional role of the author, and obviously copyright, reputation, and ownership. At the conference we were at Berlin, the I Annotate conference, which was the first meeting of that web annotation community conference outside the USA, that was its first meeting in Europe. There was a really interesting presentation from people. Well, there was lots of interesting presentations, but there's one particular about the misuse of this type of technology for far extreme groups, hate groups and stuff like this, which is a bit disturbing. But in a more general sense, it's where does the authorship end and someone else's work start? So the last point is important. These technologies can circumvent decisions that the content owner might have made about whether they want comment in the first place. So the only way I think you could use a Creative Commons system to prevent this kind of thing is if you attach a no derivatives license to your work. And even then, I think it's an interesting one, whether it would be classed as a derivative or not. Because if you go back to the conceptual model, these are appearing in two layers. I suspect it could be classed as a derivative. But this is where these technologies are starting to blur the distinction between authors and other people who are using content on the web. So that's an interesting tension, if you like, between the politics and the utility of this technology. And here's a second item about politics and utility. When we were at this conference, we were really interested in a presentation by a group of investigative journalists that were using these technologies for kind of obvious reasons. And they were using it in a closed manner for fact-checking with each other. Some of them had been working on some quite big-scale investigative journalism projects with leaked data from various places. And it's worth just reading out what they say here, because I know the text is quite small. But the interesting thing for us was this applied equally to a group of bioscientists that we'd been working with on our project, who used very high-resolution microscope videos. And the crossover between the investigative journalists and the bioscience scientists was, that use case almost mapped exactly, because they were the scientists, as were the journalists, had to collaborate on stories, but they were also in fierce competition as well. So they had this matched both cases. This is the statement from the investigative journalism panel. This is where the annotations can become the message stream environment around source documents and data. And you can see here the crossover to educational applications. There are other tech challenges, such as data security during the research process and after publication, especially when involving larger groups of users with different tech capabilities. These would be distributed researchers, distributed journalists, but they could be distributed learners as well. So both source documents and annotations need a secure infrastructure, given the sensitive aspect of the investigative journal process. Sources and stories need to be protected. That was really interesting for us. Anyway, moving on. Image annotation on the web is being pushed forward by the IIIF community, which stands for the International Image Interoperability Framework, and a company called Digerati in the UK have been working with the Wellcome Trust to produce a universal image annotation viewer, and the Wellcome Digital Library have rolled that out for you if you want to examine that. We've been working a little bit with them on our data model as well that we're using in the Clipper project. And here's an example of some image annotation that they've produced from the Wellcome Library Trust. So we've covered textual annotations, image annotations. So we're looking at our project now, the problem of using audio and video. They're not particularly well supported by institutional research infrastructures, but it is rapidly expanding across all fields, not just humanities. I've just spoken to you about biosciences using this kind of data. It's becoming ubiquitous in our daily lives, but it has got certain pragmatic problems involved with it. And these are the basic problems. It's got very large file sizes, and we call it a lumpy data format. And by that we mean it's time consuming to analyze. You have to find the right bit and all the rest of it, and it's hard to share analysis. Our project started off in a research domain, but we're moving out now into education and training and culture, I guess. So our solution to this has been the Clipper project, where we're using annotation, web annotation techniques. We're creating virtual clips that can be shared as URIs and annotated using free text. Now the benefit of this is it respects the content owner's rights and permissions policy. We're not physically copying or moving around the files. They stay in one place. So that's got a lot of benefits. If the content is sensitive, if it's medical or legal, or it's got underage people, then the clip that we create using our annotation tool can only be shared with people who have got the same access rights. But the content of our clips, the annotation notes, start time, the end time, that can be shared. So that it's like an exotic form of metadata, if you like, or paradata. But they also support social media integration and new forms of collaboration. So it means you've got the potential of surfacing this kind of problematical data form, audio and video, outside your system if you choose to. And in our beta version, we've got the ability to share it in all the common social media frameworks. So it effectively allows you to drop into an audio or a video file, see the bit I've selected, and you don't move the file around, you don't copy it around, and you can see the notes that I've attached to that file. And that, because that appears in our player on top, in our layer on top of the video that you're watching. So we think it's got a lot of potential, the Clipper project, as you would naturally think. And because we're surfacing, if you like, content out of these formats, which are hitherto been difficult to surface, it can drive a lot of traffic to a site if you want to for open educational purposes. And that in turn can provide a rich source of analytics, quantitative and qualitative. We're doing some work with the National Library of Scotland Moving Image Archive at the moment to discuss possible ways forward to do a pilot, because they faced a challenge that all archives face and also educators face. You've got all this stuff, you've got a great expense of creating it, but if no one uses it, there's not much point. So that we're making audio and video as easy to work with as text. The current prototype is working with MP3, MP4, MP3 U8, which is commonly used by archives, and it works nicely with YouTube, Vimeo, SoundCloud, etc. So it's got leisure applications as well, or educational. And that's where the location of the early release is, clipperdev.com. Oh yeah, this is, so in a nutshell, we create a virtual clip by selecting the source file and the start and the end times. We organize that clip, annotate it, and we can store these clips in clip lists, a playlist of clips. And they can be stored in projects, and you can share in quite a granular way, a clip list or a project. So these are our plans that we're involved in at the minute. My colleague loves these animations. I'm not such a great fan. Open source code's on GitHub. We're compliant with the W3C annotation data model. We're planning a subscription service for a small fee to keep the lights on. You can install it yourself if you want to. We're going to include a license picker for user-generated content for your own notes, using all the Creative Commons forms. It will work with Dropbox, interestingly enough, as well. It works quite sweetly with Dropbox. It works particularly well with audio because it's low bandwidth. And I suspect personally that's going to be bigger than the video element. We're planning on data export. We don't want to trap your content in our system. It's stored in JSON-LD at the moment. We're going to have that as a download, that you can download a clip list or project as you choose, so that you can take your stuff out of our system. And we've had requests for converting our clip list data into CSV, XML, HTML, and things like that. And we've got to continue to develop the system because we like it. And that's a wrap up. That's further information you can find at the blog clippertube.com. We'll be launching a subscription service under clippertube.com this year, hopefully. It's been a low budget project, so we've been quite nimble. And I should say a big shout out for vocational education, where I come from. It also works with Facebook as well for Facebook videos. We've got a bit more work to do on that, but proving that you can do something for assessment purposes using these media is a really big deal for us. Thanks. Yeah, oh yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering, does the tool also archive the audio or video somewhere, or is it just sit on top as a metadata layer?
It's got that option if it's installed in your system. What we're doing is we're just pointing out to wherever on the web, but wherever on the web could be in your system. And if you do that, then I think I know what comes next. Yes, you could have a compile function, and you could compile your virtual clips into real clips for download and takeaway. We had that request. Interesting enough, another interesting thing about this project is the requirements of data scientists working with huge file sizes not only mapped onto investigative journalist requirements, they also mapped onto the requirements of performing arts researchers. So we knew we were in a sweet space because it was pleasing so many people, and they all wanted that functionality. It's not an editing tool, and we're resisting that because there's loads of them out there. But it allows you to do stuff you couldn't do before, and with a few tweaks, if it was on your system, you could make it do lots of other things.
And I really appreciate the fact that you're allowing people to export that data.
Yeah, it's an ethical position. We don't want to be in that box where we're trapping your stuff. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much once again. And next up is Jane Secker speaking about, lecture recording. You've got the microphone behind you.
Thanks very much. Okay. Hi everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Jane Secker from London School of Economics, where I'm the Copyright and Digital Literacy Advisor for the next week or so. And I'm going to be talking to you about some research that was published last year on a survey and policy analysis of lecture recording, and kind of some reflections since that's come out on what it means to be open. So I'm presenting this on behalf of myself and Chris Morrison from the University of Kent, and we did this work together. First up, just to kind of tell you a bit about the research team. So Chris and I have been doing quite a lot of work in the kind of area that we call copyright literacy, and kind of educating anyone who'll listen really about the delights and excitements of copyright. But this piece of work that we did was specifically about lecture recording and the copyright and intellectual policy sort of that are around in universities. Worked with a research assistant, Juliana Rios-Amaya, who was a master's student at LSE, and the report, as I say, has been available for a number of months now. It's on the LSE Research Online repository, it's on the University of Kent one, and it was also just a couple of weeks ago republished by Create at the University of Glasgow as one of their working papers as well. You know, we're very grateful to the kind of interest that this has had as well from the community. But particularly today, I guess what I wanted to focus on was this idea of whether lecture recording, which is a kind of fairly widespread technology that's being used, is actually telling us anything about open practice. So the kind of slide really is sort of just showing this idea that, you know, is it opening the door to the classroom? Is putting our lectures online in some way part of open practice? Or in fact, does it show that in higher education we've still got quite a long way to go, I think, really, with moving towards a culture of open practice when you have conversations with academics. And I think that really what I'd kind of start by saying is that I think, you know, very much just recording a lecture is very similar to just uploading slides to the VLE, and it's not really moving us on very much. And I think it's raising a lot of issues around copyright, intellectual property issues, and how policies may not necessarily always reflect what's going on in terms of practice. So we've done a couple of talks about this, and we entitled our report Is a Risky Business, with a sort of slight reference to the 1980s Tom Cruise film that some of you might be familiar with. I'm showing you a couple of screenshots here from the film, with some credits, of course. And this is kind of one of the really key issues. So this is third-party content. These are images that have been taken from a video of the film Risky Business. I'm showing them. I'm being live streamed. Is that a risk in doing that? You know, I haven't got permission. I have put credit on there. And arguably, in a classroom, in a closed space, when I'm not being broadcast on the internet, then, you know, we could say, yes, this is fine. There is an exception in UK copyright law, section 32, illustration for instruction, and that's fine. But is it fine if it's been recorded and it's been put out there on the open web? Arguably, as I say, I'm taking a bit of a risk here in doing this, so just kind of highlighting that. And I think one of the issues is really here is around the idea of the copyright exceptions that we have in the UK. If we're using things in the classroom, as I say, illustration for instructions, one of the important ones. But what about the kind of licenses that we have available? And if we were putting up extracts from published works, for example, we'd be using the Copyright Licensing Agency's license. We'd be having to abide by those terms and conditions. What about images? Should we have some kind of license that allows us to do this? And would it ever extend to allowing us to put up an open recording like this? I will say a little bit about MOOCs at the end, because I think they are an area where there's been a lot of consideration, obviously, about these issues. And generally, our research here was about what's going on in closed kind of classrooms and behind passwords. Anyway, so yeah, many exceptions that exist, and essentially here, you know, contracts that come out cannot now in UK law override the copyright exceptions we have. But you know, when we do things in an open space, I think, you know, it is arguable whether that's permitted. Okay, so what did we do? The survey was done last year and went out quite widely in the sort of e-learning and the copyright field. There was quite a number of us involved in devising the questions, so I've kind of got the full list of people, quite a number of copyright officers. Actually, it's quite a lengthy survey, and we got 33 institutions who respond, so I'll caveat everything in what I'm saying, that this is really just a kind of snapshot of what's happening in a selection of institutions. It's not completely across the board. But what were we having a look at? So we were looking at what the actual lecture recording and IPR policies actually said, where they might exist, whether they were formalised. We had a look at issues around consent from the individuals who are being recorded. So in many cases, obviously, that's the academic staff, whether they were opting in and opting out of recording. Particularly interested in this issue around third-party content that might be available and might be shown in slides, and what institutions were doing about this material. And as I say, underlying the kind of piece of research that we were doing were questions we had about open practice, whether Creative Commons licenses were being used to source content, whether material was going up online with Creative Commons licenses on it. And then just kind of a whole host of what we've called wider IPR issues. So how what was happening in relation to lecture recording might relate to what was happening with discussions about ownership of other types of content in the institution, teaching materials, research materials, etc. And yeah, if you have a look, that's our website there. Now I'm going to whiz through, because you can read the report, as I say, in many places. So I'm going to whiz through just a couple of the kind of really key headline findings and pick out a few things that I think are interesting in the context of today. The first one is around the sort of survey and what it said about whether there was actually a policy that specifically mentioned lecture recording and IPR issues. So what we see here is a bit of a mixed picture. Only a third of institutions, or 29%, actually had a written policy. So we had quite a number of institutions that said they definitely didn't have one, and some that sort of said they sort of had a policy. So I think that was kind of a bit of a sort of, fudging of the issue here. So some were saying that they were in the process of devising a policy. Some said, well, it's not exactly a policy. We've just kind of got various documents all over the place. One of the really important things we wanted to know was how much academics have been consulted when drawing up the kind of approach to lecture recording. And I knew from my own institution it had been massively controversial, the kind of policy around opt-in and opt-out. But what we did see here is, less than half of the institutions actually said that they widely consulted with staff before introducing lecture recording, which is obviously quite interesting. But what we are seeing is that in most cases it's kind of down to individual staff, so they're allowed to opt in 3/4 of the institutions to whether they want to be recorded. So maybe they didn't have a choice about whether the systems were put in place in the classrooms, but they are given a choice about whether they actually are recorded. But it is also, we're seeing a move towards opt-out, and there's various kind of reasons around accessibility and student demand why we might see more institutions move to opt-out. Some interesting findings here about issues around third-party copyright. So I was talking about the kind of content like the risky business slides I was showing there, images, all sorts of other content. So who has responsibility for rights issues related to that content? And pretty clear cut, it's quite small on the slides, but it's 94% of respondents, it's the lecturer basically who has to deal with that. It's left up to them. It's very rare that you would have somebody kind of going in and actually checking these things before they're made available. And quite a number of comments really that it's up to the lecturer to kind of recognise that there might be an issue with content and then apply for permission or speak to somebody for some advice. Here what we see is that very, very few, and for obvious practical reasons, very few universities are reviewing the content after it's been made available. So I think we've got like one institution it was like 3 or 4% reply, that one that just said yes, they were reviewing them. Everybody else, the number of recordings that are going on simultaneously on our campus, it's just not going to be practical to do that. We had some interesting contradictions around how staff were being made aware of copyright issues. What I would say is that there's quite a kind of hands-off approach. So there is information in 3/4 of the institutions that's available when you agree to use the system. This is what we have at LSE. It's kind of like a tick box. Yes, I have read this. I haven't got any third-party content in here. If I have, I've taken all responsibility for it. And again, quite a number of the institutions, 3/4, had information on the website about that, but it was fairly rare that it was actually being included as part of staff induction or kind of training to talk to them about these issues. But what we can see, and I think this is kind of where institutions are kind of covering themselves in a lot of cases, is that in most of the instances, the recordings are actually just made available via the lecture recording system, which is password controlled. They're on the VLE. There is, I think there is literally, very few that are uploading recordings routinely to YouTube. On any website, no password required. We've got 6% saying that that's what was happening. And quite a number of institutions, as I say, went on in the comment section to talk about how procedures might be different if it was a public lecture that was being recorded and was going onto their YouTube channel, for example, or if it was something that was being done for a MOOC. Another interesting part of this research that we did, so we got 11 institutions to supply us with their full policy, so we could do an analysis of these documents in quite a lot of detail. And what we did, because there is obviously, and it's been available for a number of years, GIST guidance on best practice for copyright and IP issues with relation to lecture recordings. So we kind of used that as a benchmark and compared the 11 institutions who gave us their documents. One of the things that was a bit tricky was that obviously some of the policies, some institutions did agree to send us things that they kept in password protected areas, but for a lot of institutions, these policy documents weren't easy to find online. So they probably were available to staff at the institution, but it's quite difficult for us to see them. And we could only examine, what we were given access to. So there may be more that we didn't see. And what we tried to do here, so we've created these categories for sort of having a look at how we would assess the 11 institutions in a bit more detail. So we're interested in issues to do with appetite for risk, and support and guidance, but particularly open practice. That was one of the really kind of key areas. And we have quite a number of emerging patterns that come out here. This chart on the left, what it shows is that the institutions who provide the higher level support of copyright advice, it kind of goes hand in hand with being more likely to support open practice. So where you're wanting to be more open, inevitably staff do need to know more about what they can and can't do, third-party content, etc. We also have quite a number of other findings. I'll kind of go through them quite quickly, I think, because I'm nearly out of time, and I'd like to see if there's any questions. The GIST guidance has not really been widely followed in the sector. That's one thing that's really clear, and we have definitely got a real variety of approaches. I think, this point here that support needs to be clear, helpful and practical is kind of common sense, but in many cases the support isn't at the moment. It's very, very confusing and contradictory for somebody who knows about copyright. So for many of our academic staff, I suspect it's not really encouraging them, and it's difficult also to see whether this is related to institutions being quite risk averse and quite cautious, or drawing up a policy and then kind of just slightly shutting their eyes to what might be happening in practice. But it is also clear that even things like Creative Commons and using Creative Commons content for inclusion of images, putting licenses on recordings, this is not happening generally across the sector. So a whole host of recommendations that we had, as effectively copyright advice and guidance does need to be better provided, I think, to support the idea of open practice. And that kind of sort of want to finish really with just sort of talking about some of the work that I've been doing. Chris and I ran a workshop a couple of weeks ago up at the University of Manchester about embedding open practice, and discussing this with academic staff kind of really at the outset of their career as well. The importance of them understanding, that they can make choices about all sorts of things, not just lecture recording, but their publications, their teaching materials. But it needs to be done in a supportive way and quite a fun way. So we've got a kind of range of games and activities which you can find out more about on our website. Got a whole host of other research really that I think we wanted to do, and to sort of, I think it's really about getting staff engaged in this rather than them thinking, oh, well, one way I could just be open is to effectively just record my lectures, and that's, like opening the door, because that is not, as far as we can see, open practice. Got some further reading there, a bit of a plug for the book, and of course the credits for the images. My slides are on SlideShare already, so you can find those, and hopefully I've got like 1 minute for some questions. Yeah.
Can we, while you take questions, have Nicole set up since
Yes,
she's
of
using
course.
her own computer?
Yes,
Thank
yes.
you.
Thanks for that, Jane, and all the research that you do that I like to read. Your research clearly shows that we have a long way to go into educating people in universities on how to deal with copyright. As someone who also teaches copyright to not mostly academic teachers, but to high school teachers, what do you think should be the priority? To engage them into the open culture, or first educate them on the basics of copyright? Like, what would your suggestion be?
Well, I mean, my experience of kind of trying to teach them about copyright for the past 15 years has not been massively positive in terms of, you know, that's the session that everybody avoids coming to.
I know.
So in many ways, I've come up with quite a number of creative approaches to running copyright sessions. I mentioned, you know, I mean, largely not calling it copyright and describing a session as open practice and openness has been hugely positive. The session that we did at Manchester a few weeks ago, 25 academics, I probably had the most engaged discussions about copyright I've had for a really long time, and at no point really did, you know, that's not how the session was badged. It was about asking them to think about the choices they make and the kind of the level of openness that they want, you know, with sharing all sorts of things, as I say. So you know, I'm not saying that you hide it from them, but it's just never going to be a popular session. It's seen as a compliance issue if you say you're running a session about copyright, and a lot of teachers will just say they're going to tell me I can't do loads of things that I'm doing, so I'd rather not know and I won't come. So, but I mean, you know, lots of things you can do. Give them cake, that helps.
Great, thank you.
David, did you have a question? Yeah.
Thanks, Jane. That was really interesting. I was wondering if you found out through the work you'd done why the GIST guidance hadn't been adhered to or wasn't being used by institutions. I just wondered if you had any insights into that.
I think one of the issues with the GIST guidance is it's quite a high bar, some of the things that it's proposing. So it's sort of idealistic in a way that it's sort of saying, well, you should do this and you should do this and you should do this. And I think quite enough in reality, a lot of institutions have just found, you know, that they haven't been able to do the amount of work that they felt they needed. I mean, we had a discussion with John Kelly at GISC about, you know, whether we could revise this guidance and kind of make it a little bit more supportive in a way, because I just think it's seen as something that's slightly unachievable. Well, that's the guidance, but the reality is, you know, when you get into discussions with academics about whether they want to assign their rights or how they want to license them, they don't even understand the first thing about, you know, copyright issues. So it can just depend a lot on the institution's culture as well, I think. And a lot on the level of understanding that the sort of senior policymakers have in the institution about these issues, which is generally quite low. And so, you know, I think they've just found the guidance quite difficult to engage with.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
Our last speaker will be Nicole Allen, and I will say it already that we'll run a bit over time. Apologies, this is all my fault for not keeping the time properly, but I hope you give Nicole a chance to have her talk, and it won't be too much over time.
And it's no problem if you guys need to go out.
No, I don't. I think we're fine. I hope.
Try to keep it quick.
Yes.
So, hi everybody, I'm Nicole Allen. I am Director of Open Education for SPARC, which is an advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. We're a membership organization of academic and research libraries across the world. And we work to advocate for openness as the default in research and education. We also have sister organizations in regions around the world. We have SPARC Europe here. Vanessa Proudman, the executive director, is attending this conference, which is fantastic, in Africa and Japan as well. So my goal here today is to talk about communication and talking about open. We're all here because we believe that open is important and see it as part of our vision for education. But talking to open advocates across the world, one of the most common frustrations you hear is, how do I get other people to see what I see? How do I get them to understand what open is and what its power is and what the potential is? And what I'm hoping to do here is to spend a few minutes running through a couple of things that you can take away and think about when you go back to your campuses and contexts. I'm going to move quickly, given the time, but I've posted these slides on SlideShare here and tweeted them out as well, so you can follow up on any information here. So basically the things we'll cover is defining open, communicating effectively, being responsive to conditions in the outside world when other people talk about open. And then finally, wrap up with a few parting thoughts. So in terms of defining open, there are two key parts. So open means something very specific: free of cost, free of barriers, and permissions, the right to fully use the resource in all of the ways that is possible in the digital environment. And these two components are important anytime you're talking about open. It's important to include both of these things. Open is not just digital. Open is not just free. Open is not just permission. It is free plus permissions in any format. And when we talk about the permissions, we use the 5R framework to define what those permissions are. Retain, reuse, revise, remix, and redistribute. This isn't always the most effective framework for communicating to other people what openness means, but it is useful to keep in mind in terms of definitions. There are some people who define it this way, so that open means permissions and free is enabled by those permissions, and that's fine too. You may choose to define it that way. That's all good, as long as both free and permissions are part of it. So this is the Hewlett definition of OER. Open educational resources are teaching, learning, and research resources that reside in the public domain or have been released under an intellectual property license that permits their free use or repurposing by others. That is important in terms of a definition. It is not always the most useful way to define open when you're sitting down with a professor that's never heard of open educational resources before, or a policymaker, or a student. It does cover both parts, permissions and free use. There's the UNESCO definition, which is a little bit longer, and includes a little bit more about the mediums, whether it's digital or otherwise. And it contains both free and permissions, but it's still a little bit kind of long and wonky. So here's some words that we've found effective in terms of communicating both parts of the definition, but in a little bit simpler and easier to access way. OER are educational materials that are distributed at no cost with legal permission for the public to freely use, share, and build upon the content. Here's another way. Freely available, high-quality learning materials that can be downloaded, edited, and shared to better serve all students. This language was developed by a high-end communications firm based in Washington, D.C. for our U.S. policy work. So some of this may not be relevant in your context, the parts of this, but a lot of thought went into crafting these words. So just some words that might be useful to you in talking about OER. Okay, next part. Going through a couple of things to think about in terms of being an effective communicator. And some of these are really basic tips, but I feel like it's always helpful to be reminded of them. So the first ground rule of effective communications is knowing your audience, know who you're communicating to. And remember that what you're saying isn't about you. What you care about, why you care about open, and why you think it's important isn't what matters. What matters is why who you're talking to thinks it's important. So, these are some of the common audiences that we encounter on campuses: students, faculty, administrators, policymakers. So what are some of the things that students are going to care about with OER? Cost, right? That's a really important piece of it. Access, convenience. Faculty care about academic freedom, the ability to customize materials to make them their own. Quality. Administrators care about making education more effective to deliver better results, help students get to graduation faster. Policymakers care, often about cost, again, about efficacy, and about just more effective systems for governance. Tip 2, having your message and repeating it. It's important as over the term of the time you're communicating to make sure that you're presenting a consistent message, and somebody needs to hear it several times before it really sinks in. So it's important to plan out what you're going to say, what the parts are, and make sure that people hear it in several times in several different ways. And the messaging that we typically use on our campuses is open is free plus 5 Rs. That's always part of it. Open empowers educators by giving them freedom and ownership over the materials they're using. And it turns out better for students, because that's why we're all here doing education, and that's why open's important. Focusing on the why, not just the what. I think one of the traps that open advocates fall into is thinking about open as the goal and the end and the thing we're fighting for. But it's not about open, it's about what open enables. It's whether, what we're fighting for is to make education more effective for students, to empower teachers to have more agency in the classroom, to more effectively share information as a society. And the framework that we often use in defining how we talk about the why is open in order to do what? What is the why are you doing open? Another thing that we see a lot in the open community is jargon, and I think that's true of any specialized field, is that you kind of fall into the terms. The 5 Rs are one example of that. Another is the CC by SA, and to a faculty member, that sounds like CC by SA, WTF. So Creative Commons licensing is critically important. It's part of what open is and how we enable it. It is not always the most important thing to go through all of the different types of licenses and their acronyms in the first time you're talking to somebody about OER. So just be conscious of that. And then finally, remember to show, not just tell. Stories and facts can be really compelling in the way that we illustrate why open. So and I actually pulled these slides from my normal slide deck, or my keynote slide deck, and one of the programs we talk about a lot in the US is Tidewater Community College's Z degree program, which is a 2-year business administration degree that uses OER in every single course. So, for example, if I'm sitting down with a policymaker and telling them about OER, it saves students money, and there's this great program. You can just tell them about the program, or you can give them a fact that shows by using OER in every single course, the Z degree is actually cutting the cost of education for these students by 20%. But take it to the next level. So not only is it cutting the cost, but it's impacting people's lives. So if I'm talking to a policymaker, here's an example I might give. So I spoke to one of your constituents who took this course. And she says with the money that she saved on textbooks, she was able to put braces on her daughter. She didn't have to choose between giving her daughter a beautiful smile for the rest of her life and buying textbooks. So that's powerful, and that can move a policymaker. But going back to remembering your audience, that story isn't going to be effective in all communities. So for example, if you're telling that story to somebody from the developing world, braces are a first world problem. Let's talk about students choosing between buying textbooks and feeding their families. And in the United States, we have communities where students are experiencing food insecurity and actually are choosing between textbooks and food. So maybe this isn't the right story for that community, but a story about a student who is able to save money on textbooks and be able to afford a larger apartment for their family because they have a new child coming, or afford childcare so that their partner can work. So just remember the audience and think about how the stories you're telling will appeal to the audience you're talking to. Okay. Final part, Couple of examples and tips about responsive communication. So what I've been talking about so far is about proactive communications, how you're defining the message, how you're communicating OER. But what happens when other people start talking about OER? And how do you respond to situations where people are talking about it in a way that we don't agree with? So just to give you, I have 3 examples. Here's one. This article ran last week. It's in Inside Higher Ed, which is a US trade publication for the higher ed industry. Can we afford textbooks? This is an essay by a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, which is actually one of the leading universities on OER. They have a fabulous program that's been emulated all across the country. But this professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, who is currently the interim dean of their education college, wrote this piece that basically argued that OER are worthless and we need to start using traditional publishers' materials that have adaptive learning technology built into them, that free is not enough. Which, is a valid point, that free isn't enough, and that we need educational resources to be better, and that OER are better. But here's a quote from the article. There's simply no open resources that are as flexible as traditional materials. Come on. So other quotes. Carefully conducted research shows that students who use digitally personalized learning tools are more likely to do better in class. If you click that link, where does it go? To the website of Pearson, the largest textbook publisher, with some efficacy studies conducted by them. Yeah. So, and it gets worse. So the bio of the author, yeah, so they had to add this. This bio has been updated to note that the author's connection to a publisher. So the guy has authored a bunch of textbooks that he sells, and the anecdotal experiences he talks about passionately in this article was his own book. And this was published on the first day of Open Education Week. So you can see how the community was fired up. But when this happens, it is often best to pause and take a breath and not feed the fire. Because every time you retweet, send out emails flaming this article, you're getting it more exposure and more readership and giving it more validity. So taking a breath is important. Sometimes it does make sense to respond, but not always. So I think in cases like this, it's really important to think about how facts speak for themselves, to not get drawn into the mud and get into a back and forth argument about what's better, OER or traditional materials. Here's some comments that I think were really effective. So one commenter talks about, data at my institution show that students actually do better when they use OER. Let's go back to facts. And then another person who talks about how there is OER that is comparable to traditional publishers' materials. Other commenters pointed out that there is peer-reviewed research that backs up the fact that OER is often more effective than traditional materials. So anyway, that is the first example of news. Here's the second one. So this is an OER program in the state of Michigan. They got $300,000 from the state to develop open textbooks for use in their K-12 schools. And there was this big expose that found that in these articles there were a bunch of typos, and there was some improper references to slavery. So first of all, this was really bad for this project because they got a ton of exposure in a really negative way. So first of all, it's important to think about who's the right person to respond. And in this case, it was actually to have the school superintendent to respond and say that actually our schools are using these materials and they're really high quality, and they're actually great. And it's also important to make sure that the community understands that when these articles come out and blow things out of proportion, that your community is ready to respond with talking points and know kind of what to say. Because how people talk about it, like if they hear from their dean or hear from or run across it in the news that they have words to respond. And this is what we sent out to our community with how to respond to this if it came up. And then the thing is, errors in textbooks happen, right? It happens all the time. And this is just one example of that happened like within a couple of weeks of this article, that there was a big scandal where one of the traditional publishers treated slavery insensitively. And so it's important to point out that this happens, but the difference is that with open resources, the error was addressed in 48 hours. They updated their text in 48 hours. Whereas McGraw-Hill's solution to this problem, the big textbook publisher, was to send out stickers to campuses to cover up the offending section of the textbook. Or if you want it replaced, you can buy another copy of the textbook in the next printing. But remember that, schools can only buy textbooks every so many years because they can't afford to buy them every year. So basically, it was a non-solution, whereas with open resources, you can address it right away. So final example on open washing. So here was an example where there was this big program about ebooks announced. It was really exciting, and it's a fabulous program. But most of the resources that are part of it are closed, actually. They're donated by publishers and made available through this app to low-income kids with a login, which is great. But the problem is that the article talked about how this is part of the Obama administration's effort to expand OER, which was wrong because these resources were not OER. And in cases like this is so important to fight back against open washing. When we see open washing, it's important to say something. And what happened is that members of our community went to the newspaper that published this and actually got them to change the text of the article online to reflect that this actually was not about open resources. And the thing is that once we did this, it actually educated the news outlet that here's how you talk about OER. And since then, they've been much better about whenever they publish an article on OER that they talk about it the right way. So that brings us full circle back to this idea that communicating effectively is the first line of defense. Give people the words to effectively talk about open educational resources. And remember that as open advocates, it's not just about why we care about it. It's important to arm other people to talk about it in ways that are going to be appealing to other audiences. So to sum up, open is free plus 5 Rs. It is a process. It's important to acknowledge that this isn't something that can happen overnight. There are meaningful steps we can take in this direction, and those steps should be celebrated. Opens is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. And then finally, that open is changing lives. It has a real impact, and we need to tell those stories. Thank you.
Okay, any quick comments or questions?
Just a very quick one. In fact, I think something was missing, which was the last but one slide when you said that open is a means. In fact, what I use as a strategy when talking to resistant or allergic teachers or professors to openness, especially, not so much policymakers, I don't try to convince them about using OER, but about how by using OER, even without thinking about this, they can achieve what they want. Mm-hmm. So it's not about OER, it's about open pedagogy, it's about doing new things, doing good stuff, and then they come to me and they say, yeah, but what about copyright? Or say, okay, and here I get you. Now that you are convinced that that is good for you, let's discuss OER and copyright and permissions and stuff. So normally, I use this multiple entry points I was talking about before, or backdoor, let's say, to reach the OER discourse, because as Jane was saying before, some people seem really allergic to that. When you go into copyright, they say, they escape. That's I don't know if that's also your experience somehow.
Yeah, I think everything you just said makes a lot of sense, and I think it is important to remember that it's not always about open. It's about what you need to do in the end, and then open is the way you get there, as long as we're being clear about what open means, so that we don't get into open washing territory. Good.
Okay, thank you very much, Nicole. Thank you all for participating. This was for me very interesting, as in the beginning I wasn't sure the talks will connect, and they connected extremely well. One interesting thing for me is at the level of the types of resources. We're getting into a really complex model that requires some complex knowledge, again, things like annotations, or when you do video. At the same time, I really like this theme that's in the end. I like the term embedding open practices in the practitioners. You said it more elegantly, but because that human factor there, and you need to basically have a lifestyle change. That was the second theme, and the third is that CC by SA WTF theme. Someone needs to do like a design challenge, just there must be a solution to stop using those acronyms while still explaining to people what we mean, but I think we just maybe need more, I don't know, artists and designers and who knows whom to figure it out. What? Well, maybe one license with a nice name like the Sun license or the Flowers license or something. Anyway, thank you very much. Once again, my apologies for using up some of your lunchtime. And please enjoy the rest of the day and your lunch break. Thank you.